Millionaire woman marries a poor cook after 7 days. She discovers the truth about his past in the gleaming towers of Manhattan's financial district, where fortunes were made and lost with the click of a mouse. Charlotte Blackwood commanded a corner office on the 62nd floor of the Goldman Tower. At 31, she had built Blackwood Capital Management into one of the most successful hedge funds on Wall Street, managing over $12 billion in assets and earning a reputation as both brilliant and ruthless in equal measure. Her penthouse apartment in Tribeca reflected her success: minimalist, expensive, and perfectly curated. Every piece of furniture had been selected by interior designers, every artwork chosen by consultants, every detail orchestrated to project the image of a woman who had conquered the financial world. Yet as Charlotte stood in her marble bathroom each morning, applying the same war paint of makeup and power suits, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was living someone else's life. The irony of managing other people's wealth while feeling spiritually bankrupt wasn't lost on her. She had everything society said she should want: money, power, respect, independence, but she went to bed each night at her king-sized bed feeling more alone than she had as a middle-class kid from Ohio. Her routine was as predictable as the stock market's opening bell. Black coffee at 5:30 a.m., review of Asian markets by 6 o'clock, first conference call at 6:30, in the office by 7 o'clock, meetings until 8 p.m., takeout dinner eaten while reviewing tomorrow's strategy, asleep by 11 o'clock. Weekends were for catching up on work she couldn't finish during the week. This particular Friday in September should have been no different. Charlotte had planned to work through lunch, preparing for a crucial presentation to potential investors from Dubai, but her assistant had other ideas, practically forcing her out of the office with threats of hiding her laptop if she didn't take a proper lunch break. "You haven't left this building for anything but sleep in 3 days," her assistant had said, holding Charlotte's jacket hostage. "Go eat something that wasn't delivered in a plastic container. That's an order from someone who's watched you function on caffeine and ambition for too long." Reluctantly, Charlotte found herself walking the streets of Lower Manhattan, her designer heels clicking against sidewalks she rarely touched. The September air carried hints of autumn, and for the first time in months, she noticed the way sunlight filtered through the urban canyon of skyscrapers, creating patterns of light and shadow that almost looked intentional. Her aimless wandering led her to a small restaurant tucked between a dry cleaner and a convenience store on a side street she'd never noticed before. Nona's Kitchen read the hand-painted sign, and something about its humble authenticity drew her in, perhaps because it was so different from the sterile corporate world she inhabited. The interior was nothing like the expensive restaurants she usually frequented for business lunches. Red checkered tablecloths covered mismatched tables, wine bottles served as candle holders, and the walls were covered with photographs of families she didn't recognize, but who somehow looked happy in ways she'd forgotten were possible. She was seated at a small table near the window, and as she looked around at the other patrons, construction workers, elderly couples, mothers with young children, she realized she was the only person in the restaurant wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Then she saw him. The man who emerged from the kitchen to check on tables moved with a grace that seemed at odds with his humble surroundings. He was tall, with dark hair that showed traces of premature silver at the temples, and hands that moved with the precision of someone who had spent years perfecting his craft. His white chef's coat was simple and clean, and when he smiled at customers, it was with genuine warmth rather than the calculated charm she was accustomed to in her world. When he approached her table, Charlotte felt something she couldn't quite identify, a flutter of nervousness that had nothing to do with market volatility or investor presentations. "Welcome to Nona's," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place. "I'm Daniel. I don't think I've seen you here before." Charlotte found herself studying his face as he recommended dishes, noting the way his eyes lit up when He talked about the food, the obvious pride he took in his work, the complete absence of the guarded calculation she saw in every face in her professional world. She ordered the special homemade gnocchi with a sauce he described as my grandmother's secret recipe, passed down through 4 generations. As he walked back to the kitchen, Charlotte caught herself watching him, wondering about his story, his life, his dreams. The food, when it arrived, was a revelation. Charlotte had eaten at Michelin-starred restaurants, had attended galas where celebrity chefs prepared meals that cost more per plate than most people spent on groceries in a month. But this simple pasta dish, served on a plain white plate in a modest neighborhood restaurant, tasted like something she'd been searching for without knowing it. As she ate, Daniel returned to check on her, and somehow they began talking. Not the small talk she was used to: weather, stocks, sports, but real conversation. He asked about her work, and when she gave her usual abbreviated answer, he pressed gently for more details, seeming genuinely interested in understanding what she did, how she'd built her company, what drove her to succeed in such a competitive field. In return, she learned that he had worked in restaurants since he was 15, that he'd traveled across Europe learning techniques from master chefs, that he'd dreamed of opening his own place but had settled for managing Nona's when the elderly owner could no longer handle the physical demands of running a kitchen. Food is love made tangible, Daniel said, refilling her water glass. When I cook for someone, I'm giving them a piece of my soul, hoping it nourishes more than just their body. Charlotte had never heard anyone talk about their work with such passion, such purpose. In her world, everything was about profit margins and return on investment. The idea that someone could find such meaning in something as simple as cooking a meal was both foreign and fascinating. She stayed far longer than she'd intended, claiming she was conducting market research when she was really just enjoying the first genuine conversation she'd had in months. Daniel would stop by her table between his kitchen duties, and each time, Charlotte found herself relaxing in ways she'd forgotten were possible. That it was only when her phone buzzed with urgent messages from her assistant that Charlotte realized she'd been gone for 3 hours. The Dubai investors were arriving soon, and she needed to prepare for what could be the most important meeting of her career. As she prepared to leave, Daniel appeared with a small container. "Tiramisu," he said, his smile slightly shy. "I made it this morning. I thought you might enjoy it later." Charlotte accepted the container, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The simple touch sent an unexpected jolt through her system, and she found herself looking into his eyes longer than was strictly professional. "Thank you," she said, meaning more than just the dessert. "Will I see you again?" Daniel asked, and something in his tone suggested the question meant more than simple customer service. Charlotte surprised herself by saying, "I hope so." The Dubai meeting went better than expected, but throughout the presentation, Charlotte found her thoughts drifting back to the small restaurant, to Daniel's genuine smile, to the way he'd made her feel seen in ways that had nothing to do with her bank account or professional achievements. That night, as she ate the tiramisu in her sterile penthouse apartment, Charlotte realized it was the first meal she'd truly tasted in years. Every other bite had been fuel, necessity, social obligation. This was different. This was someone caring enough to create something beautiful, something meant specifically for her enjoyment. She returned to Nona's the next day, telling herself she needed lunch, and it was convenient. Daniel's face lit up when he saw her, and Charlotte felt something warm unfurl in her chest. They talked again, longer this time, about books they'd read, places they'd traveled, dreams they'd harbored and abandoned. Charlotte learned that Daniel read poetry in 3 languages, that he'd once considered becoming a teacher before falling in love with cooking, that he sent money to his mother in Sicily every month, even though it meant he lived in a studio apartment above a laundromat. Daniel learned that Charlotte had built her company from nothing, that she'd fought for every dollar and every ounce of respect in a male-dominated industry, that beneath her polished exterior was someone who remembered what it felt like to worry about paying rent. By the third day, Charlotte was rearranging her schedule around lunch at Nona's. By the fifth day, Daniel was preparing special dishes just for her, experiments and variations he wanted her opinion on. By the seventh day, they were talking not just during her lunch hour, but late into the evening after the restaurant closed. Sitting at the same table where they'd met, sharing stories and dreams over glasses of wine, Daniel brought up from the restaurant's modest cellar. It was during one of these evening conversations that something shifted between them. Daniel was describing his childhood in Sicily, the way his grandmother had taught him to cook by feel rather than recipe. When Charlotte realized she was falling in love, not the calculated, strategic love she'd imagined she might someday have, with an appropriate partner, another successful professional who would complement her lifestyle and social standing. This was something else entirely. This was the kind of love that made her forget about her portfolio performance, that made her want to know everything about another person's hopes and fears, that made her believe in possibilities she'd never considered. When Daniel walked her to her car that night, the autumn air crisp with the promise of winter, he stopped and turned to face her. "Charlotte," he said, her name sounding different in his voice than it did in conference rooms and business meetings. "I know this is crazy. I know we come from different worlds. But I can't stop thinking about you. About us. About what this could be." Charlotte felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling. Everything logical told her this was impossible. A successful hedge fund manager and a restaurant cook, a woman worth hundreds of millions and a man who lived paycheck to paycheck. Two people whose lives seemed designed to never intersect. But as she looked into Daniel's eyes, seeing honesty and vulnerability and something that looked remarkably like love, Charlotte made a decision that would have shocked everyone who thought they knew her. "What if we stopped thinking about what's reasonable," she heard herself say, "and started thinking about what's possible?" The proposal came the next day, not from Daniel, but from Charlotte herself. She arrived at Nona's during the afternoon lull, when the lunch crowd had gone and the dinner rush hadn't yet begun. Daniel was in the kitchen, preparing vegetables for the evening service when she walked in and said the words that would change both their lives. "Marry me." Daniel looked up from his cutting board, his knife suspended in mid-chop, clearly wondering if he'd heard correctly. "I know it's insane," Charlotte continued, her voice stronger now. "I know everyone will think I've lost my mind. But I've spent my entire adult life making calculated decisions, safe choices, strategic moves. And where has it gotten me? Rich and successful, and absolutely miserable." She moved closer to him, not caring that her expensive dress was getting dusty in the restaurant kitchen. "You make me feel alive in ways I'd forgotten were possible. When I'm with you, I remember who I used to be before I became who I thought I needed to be. I don't want to waste any more time being reasonable. I want to be happy. And being with you makes me happier than all my success ever has." Daniel set down his knife, wiping his hands on his apron as he processed what she was saying. "Charlotte, I know you probably think I'm crazy," she interrupted. "I know you probably think this is some kind of midlife crisis or rebellion against my uptight world, but it's not. This is me finally making a choice based on what I want instead of what I think I should want." What happened next surprised them both. Daniel began to laugh, not mockingly, but with pure joy, the sound filling the small kitchen like music. "7 days, he said, shaking his head in amazement. "I've known you for 7 days, and you're proposing to me in my kitchen. Is that a yes?" Charlotte asked, suddenly nervous. Instead of answering with words, Daniel stepped forward, cupped her face in his hands that smelled of garlic and herbs and honest work, and kissed her with a passion that made her forget every rational objection her mind was trying to raise. The wedding took place 3 days later. A simple ceremony at City Hall with 2 witnesses pulled from the street, and a justice of the peace who had seen enough unusual couples to not bat an eye at the mismatch between Charlotte's designer wedding dress and Daniel's borrowed suit. Charlotte's world reacted exactly as she'd expected. Her business partners questioned her sanity. Her social circle whispered about nervous breakdowns and gold diggers, and the financial press had a field day with the story of the hedge fund queen who married her cook. But as Charlotte stood in Daniel's modest apartment, their apartment now surrounded by his few possessions and the smell of whatever he was preparing for their first dinner as husband and wife, she felt more at home than she ever had in her expensive penthouse. Daniel had insisted they live in his place rather than her Tribeca apartment, at least initially. "I want to show you my world," he'd said, "before we figure out what our world looks like." The apartment was tiny, a studio with a kitchenette, a bed that doubled as a couch, and a single window that looked out onto a fire escape. It was smaller than Charlotte's walk-in closet, and everything she owned was worth more than Daniel's entire life savings. But as they ate the simple meal, Daniel had prepared pasta with fresh tomatoes and basil from a windowsill garden he tended. With the same care other people gave to stock portfolios, Charlotte realized she had never felt wealthier. They spent their first week of marriage getting to know each other in ways their whirlwind courtship hadn't allowed. Charlotte learned that Daniel woke before dawn to go to the wholesale markets, selecting ingredients with the same attention to detail she brought to analyzing companies. She discovered he could speak Italian, Spanish, and French fluently, that he read voraciously, that he sent postcards to his elderly neighbors when he traveled. Daniel learned that Charlotte was funnier than her professional persona suggested, that she had a photographic memory for numbers but couldn't remember where she'd put her keys, that she'd never learned to cook anything more complicated than toast, because she'd been focused on building her career since college. But even as they settled into domestic life, Charlotte began to notice things that didn't quite add up. Small things at first, the way Daniel would sometimes slip into what sounded like academic language when he thought she wasn't listening. The books on his shelf that seemed too advanced for someone who'd been working in restaurants since he was 15. The way he seemed to know more about her industry than a cook should. One morning, she woke to find Daniel gone, with only a note saying he'd had to run an early errand and would be back soon. When she looked for something to read while she waited, she noticed a laptop tucked behind some cookbooks, expensive, professional grade, not the kind of thing someone living paycheck to paycheck would own. The discovery unsettled her in ways she couldn't quite articulate. In her business world, information was power, and secrets were usually dangerous. But this was her husband, the man she'd married after knowing him for 7 days, the person she'd chosen to trust with her heart, despite every rational instinct, telling her to protect herself. As their first week of marriage drew to a close, Charlotte found herself torn between the happiness she felt when they were together and a growing suspicion that Daniel wasn't entirely who he claimed to be. The contradiction created a tension she didn't know how to resolve. Should she trust her feelings or her instincts? Should she ask direct questions or wait for him to reveal whatever he was hiding? The answer would come sooner than she expected, in a way that would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and the stories people tell to protect the ones they care about most. The revelation began with a phone call Charlotte wasn't meant to overhear. It was early morning, on their 8th day of marriage, and Daniel thought she was still asleep. Charlotte had woken to use the bathroom and was returning to bed when she heard him speaking quietly into his phone near the small kitchen window, his voice carrying the kind of authority she'd never heard from him before. "The quarterly projections look solid, but I want to see the breakdown by sector before we move forward," Daniel was saying, his accent completely gone, his tone crisp and professional. "And make sure the European markets analysis includes the impact of the new regulations. I don't want any surprises when I review the reports." Charlotte froze in the bathroom doorway, her heart beginning to pound. The man speaking sounded nothing like the humble cook she'd married. This voice belonged to someone accustomed to giving Orders, someone who understood complex financial concepts, someone who moved in the same professional world she did. I know I've been unavailable, Daniel continued, but the situation is complicated. I need another week, maybe 2, before I can return to normal operations. Can you handle the Singapore deal without me? Singapore deal, quarterly projections, European markets analysis. These weren't terms a restaurant cook would use casually in a phone conversation. These were the phrases of high-level finance, of someone who managed significant assets, of someone who operated in Charlotte's world rather than outside it. Daniel ended the call and turned around, stopping short when he saw Charlotte standing in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The small apartment felt even smaller, filled with the weight of unspoken questions and the sudden awareness that their fairy tale romance might be built on something other than the truth. Charlotte, Daniel began, but she held up her hand. To stop him. Who were you talking to? She asked, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. Daniel ran his hand through his hair, a gesture she'd learned meant he was stressed or thinking hard. I can explain. That's not what I asked. Who were you talking to? The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Charlotte could see Daniel weighing his options, deciding how much truth to reveal, how much protection to maintain. It was a look she recognized from countless business negotiations, the moment when someone realizes they've been caught and must choose between deeper deception and potentially damaging honesty. My business partner, Daniel finally said, his voice resigned. My name is Daniel, that part is true. But I'm not exactly who you think I am. Charlotte felt the familiar steel of her professional persona sliding into place, the armor she wore when she needed to protect herself from people who might try to deceive or manipulate her. I think you need to start from the beginning. Daniel nodded, gesturing toward the small table where they'd shared so many meals over the past week. Could we sit down? This is going to take a while. As they sat across from each other at the table that had become the center of their brief marriage, Charlotte studied Daniel's face, looking for signs of the deception she'd apparently missed. But even now, even knowing he'd been lying to her, she could see only the man she'd fallen in love with, the gentle eyes, the hands that created beautiful food, the presence that had made her feel safe and understood. My full name is Daniel Alessandro Marchetti, he began, his voice carrying the slight Italian accent she'd noticed when they first met. I am a cook, that wasn't a lie. But I'm also the founder and CEO of Marchetti Holdings, a private equity firm that specializes in hospitality and food service acquisitions. Charlotte felt the world tilt slightly. Marchetti Holdings was a name she knew well, a competitor, a company she'd lost deals to, a firm she'd grudgingly respected for their innovative approach to restaurant and hotel investments. The CEO was notoriously private, rarely appearing in financial publications, conducting business through representatives, and maintaining an almost mythical presence in their industry. You're telling me you're Daniel Marchetti, she said slowly. The Daniel Marchetti who bought the consortium hotel chain last year. The one who turned around Romano Restaurant Group and made it profitable again. Yes, the one whose net worth Forbes estimated at over $2 billion. The estimates are conservative. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, trying to process this information. The humble cook she'd married, the man who lived in a studio apartment and sent money to his mother in Sicily, was actually one of the most successful businessmen in their industry. Someone who operated at her level, someone who could have met her as an equal in boardrooms and industry conferences. Why? She asked, the question encompassing everything. Why the deception? Why the modest apartment? Why marry her under false pretenses? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands. When he looked up, Charlotte saw something she'd never seen before: vulnerability mixed with fear, as if he was about to risk everything on her reaction. Because I was tired of being seen as a balance sheet, he said finally. Do you know how many women have pursued me once they learned about Marchetti Holdings? How many dinner invitations I've received from people who want to pitch me deals? How many relationships I've tried to build that were really just sophisticated business negotiations? Charlotte felt a familiar pang of recognition. She'd experienced the same thing from the other side men who saw her success as either a challenge to conquer or an asset to acquire. Women who befriended her hoping for investment opportunities or social connections. 3 years ago, I decided I needed to step back, Daniel continued. I bought this building, this restaurant, as an investment. But I also started working here, anonymously, under a different last name. I wanted to remember what it felt like to create something with my hands, to have conversations that weren't about profit margins and market share. So none of it was real, Charlotte said, hating how small her voice sounded. The struggling cook, the humble apartment, the man who read poetry and sent money to his mother. All of that was real, Daniel said urgently, leaning forward. My mother does live in Sicily, and I do send her money every month. I do read poetry. I do love cooking. I did work my way up through restaurant kitchens before I started my first company. The apartment is real. I chose to live here because I wanted to remember what it felt like to live simply. He reached across the table, but Charlotte pulled her hands back, not ready for physical comfort when her emotional world was in chaos. When I met you, Daniel continued, you were the first person in years who saw me as just Daniel. Not as an opportunity or a conquest or a means to an end. You talked to me about your work because you were genuinely interested in sharing your world, not because you wanted something from me. You married me thinking I was poor, thinking I could give you nothing but love. But I can give you everything, he added quietly. Not just love, but understanding. I know what it's like to be lonely at the top, to wonder if anyone would care about you if you lost everything tomorrow. I know what it's like to be successful and miserable, to have everything society says you should want and still feel empty. Charlotte stood up abruptly, pacing to the small window that looked out onto the fire escape. Her mind was racing, trying to reorganize everything she thought she knew about the past week, about Daniel, about their marriage. You let me feel sorry for you, she said, her voice harder now. You let me think I was rescuing you from a life of struggle when you were actually slumming it, playing house with the poor people. That's not fair, and it's not true, Daniel replied, standing as well. I never asked for your pity, and I never pretended to need rescuing. I fell in love with you because you saw something in me that had nothing to do with money or status. You married me because of who I was when I was with you, not because of what I could provide. But it was all a lie, Charlotte shot back. The modest apartment, the simple life, the idea that we were from different worlds, none of it was real. The feelings were real. My love for you is real. The way you made me feel when you looked at me, when you talked to me, when you chose me, that was all real. Charlotte turned to face him, and Daniel could see she was crying. Tears of anger and confusion and heartbreak streaming down her face. How am I supposed to trust anything you say now? How do I know this conversation isn't just another performance? Another role you're playing to get what you want? Daniel moved closer, stopping just out of arm's reach. Because I'm telling you the truth now, even though it might cost me everything. I could have kept the secret forever, Charlotte. You would never have found out. My business operates under multiple subsidiary names. My personal life is completely private. My staff is bound by confidentiality agreements that would make Fort Knox jealous. Then why tell me now? Because I realized something yesterday when I was watching you reorganize my spice cabinet, Daniel said, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. You were trying to bring order to my chaos, the same way you probably organize everything in your professional life. And I realized that I was asking you to build a marriage on a foundation of partial truth, and that wasn't fair to either of us. He moved closer, close enough that Charlotte could smell the familiar scent of herbs and soap that she'd come to associate with safety and home. I also realized that I don't want to be Daniel the cook anymore, if it means I can't be Daniel the businessman who happens to love cooking. I don't want to compartmentalize my life into the person I am with you and the person I am in the world. I want to be whole with you, completely honest, completely myself. Charlotte wiped her eyes, trying to think clearly through the emotional storm of the revelation. So what happens now? Do we get divorced? Do we start over? Do we pretend this conversation never happened? I don't know, Daniel admitted. I was hoping you might have some ideas. Despite everything, Charlotte found herself almost smiling at his honesty. It was such a Daniel thing to say, admitting uncertainty, asking for her input, treating their marriage as a collaboration rather than a conquest. I need time to think, she said finally. I need to figure out how I feel about all of this, about you, about us. How much time? I don't know. Maybe a few days, maybe longer. Daniel nodded, accepting her terms without argument. I'll stay at my corporate apartment. Give you space to process everything. As he gathered a few belongings, Charlotte found herself studying him with new eyes. Now that she knew the truth, she could see traces of the successful businessman in his confident movements, in the way he organized his thoughts, and the quality of the few items he chose to take with him. But she could also see the man who had fallen in love with her in a small restaurant, who had cooked for her with genuine joy, who had married her impulsively because he'd found something he didn't want to lose. Daniel, she called as he reached the door. He turned back, hope and fear warring in his expression. I'm not angry that you're successful, she said carefully. I'm angry that you didn't trust me enough to be honest from the beginning. I'm angry that you made the decision about what I could handle instead of letting me decide for myself. Daniel nodded, absorbing her words. You're right. I was protecting myself, but I was also protecting you from something you never asked to be protected from. I'm sorry. After he left, Charlotte sat alone in the small apartment that had briefly been their shared home, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The man she'd married was both exactly who she'd thought he was and completely different. The fairy tale romance that had swept her away was built on truth and deception in equal measure. But as she looked around the modest space, at the evidence of the simple life Daniel had chosen to live despite his wealth, at the cookbooks filled with handwritten notes and the windowsill garden he tended with such care, Charlotte began to understand something important Daniel hadn't been lying about who he was. He'd been living as the person he wanted to be. The humble cook and the successful businessman weren't contradictory identities. They were different facets of someone complex enough to contain multitudes. Someone who had chosen simplicity, not out of necessity, but out of desire for authenticity. The question now wasn't whether she could forgive his deception, but whether she was brave enough to build a marriage with someone who, like herself, was still figuring out how to balance success with happiness, achievement with fulfillment, the person the world expected them to be with the person they actually wanted to become. 3 days later, Charlotte called Daniel and asked him to meet her at Nona's kitchen. When he arrived, she was sitting at the same table where they'd first talked, where their unlikely love story had begun. I've been thinking, she said as he sat down across from her, about truth and deception, about the stories we tell ourselves and each other. Daniel waited, not interrupting, letting her find her words. I realized that I wasn't entirely honest with you either, Charlotte continued. When I married you, I told myself it was because I'd found true love, because I was finally choosing happiness over convention. But part of me was also rebelling against my life, against the expectations and pressures and loneliness. I was using you as much as you were using me, just differently. She reached across the table, taking his hands in hers for the first time since his revelation. The difference is, what we found together was real, even if the circumstances weren't. Entirely honest, the love is real. The connection is real. The way we make each other laugh, the way we challenge each other, the way we've both started to become better versions of ourselves. That's all real. So what are you saying? Daniel asked, hope beginning to color his voice. I'm saying that maybe the best relationships aren't built on perfect honesty, but on the willingness to become more honest with each other over time. I'm saying that I don't want to throw away something beautiful because it began imperfectly. Charlotte smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed since learning the truth about her husband. I'm also saying that I want to meet the real Daniel Marchetti, not the cook, not the CEO, but the whole person who contains both of those identities and everything in between. And I want him to meet the real Charlotte Blackwood, who's still figuring out how to be successful and happy at the same time. Daniel lifted their joined hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. I think they're going to like each other. I hope so, Charlotte said. Because they're stuck with each other for better or worse, richer or poorer, in good times and bad, and in small apartments and penthouse suites. As they sat together in the restaurant where their story began, Charlotte realized that their marriage hadn't been destroyed by the revelation of Daniel's true identity. It had been complicated, deepened, and made more real. They were no longer the millionaire and the cook, but two successful, complex people who had found in each other something neither had known they were looking for. A partner who understood both the burdens and the joys of achievement. Someone who could love them for who they were while challenging them to become who they wanted to be. Their love story would continue, not as a fairy tale of opposites attracting, but as the more complex and ultimately more satisfying story of two equals, choosing to build something beautiful together, one honest conversation at a time.
Thank you for watching this story unfold with us here on M&A The Story Unfolds. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of the world you're joining us from. Your support means everything. See you in the next story.